Chairman Schatz, Senator Whitehouse, and members of the committee. It's an honor to be here today. My name is Fred Samama. I'm the head of responsible investment at Amundi, the largest European asset manager with $1.8 trillion in assets. I'm specialized in developing financial innovations that combine additional returns for investors and positive impacts on society. Today, my testimony will focus on The Green Swans, a book I recently published with authors from the Bank for International Settlements, the Banque de France, and Columbia University. The views expressed here today are my own. First, I will explain why central banks are putting climate change on their agenda. Second, I will describe the mobilization of asset owners on climate change. And third, I will revisit the traditional green versus fiduciary responsibility debate. Our book, The Green Swan, is about central banks and climate change. In the last 2 years, 59 central banks and financial supervisors have joined the network for greening the financial system. This is because central banks now recognize that climate change threatens financial stability. Either we do nothing and then we put humanity at risk, or we adjust how we manage our systems. But the magnitude of the adjustments is so massive that it could threaten financial stability. This is why the book's authors developed the concept of green swans, inspired by the famous black swans of Nassim Nicholas Taleb. A green swan is a highly certain event with multiple non-linear and interacting causes that threatens life on Earth. Climate change is an example of a green swan. First, climate change is certain. Second, climate change carries a variety of non-linear and interacting risks, physical risks, regulatory risks, and societal risks. Third, climate change could lead to extreme losses in the short term and even to the possible extinction of part of humanity in the long term. In summary, climate change could create some potentially extremely disruptive events that underlie systemic crisis. Regarding physical risks, extreme weather events have multiplied by 4 over the past 40 years, and more heat waves, droughts, typhoons, disease pandemics, rising sea levels are to come that could destroy many physical assets like crops or coastal properties. And as insurance companies cover only 44% of the damages here in the US and 8% in Asia, households and banks are increasingly exposed. Similarly, by 2050, the World Bank estimates that 143 million people could have to migrate due to climate change. This could lead to an increase in conflicts and wars. Regarding transition risks, at the COP21, 195 countries agreed on targets to curb greenhouse emissions with already major impacts on many industries. Volkswagen lost 40% of its value for developing software to dodge new emissions regulations. In this context, how can we preserve financial stability? 2 steps are needed for this. First, traditional backward-looking risk models do not capture future risks. We need to work with new models, including scenario analysis or climate stress tests. But the deep uncertainties are such that no single model or scenario can provide a full picture of the macroeconomic and firm-level impacts caused by climate change. Central banks must recognize the limits of their existing analytical and policy toolbox. Second, central banks must play an additional role by helping coordinate the measures to fight climate change. We must obviously move forward with carbon pricing. We must explore new policy mixes to better address the climate imperatives ahead. We must reform international monetary and financial systems to recognize climate stability as a global public good. We must systematically integrate sustainability criteria in the financial sector. And here, the good news is that investors are getting mobilized. For example, 450 investors managing $41 trillion are now challenging the 100 most polluting companies, not to save the planet, but to save the assets of their beneficiaries. In parallel, investors now benefit from plug-and-play financial tools. With low-carbon equity indexes, investors can now reduce their exposure to the most polluting companies while maintaining broad market exposure. And these indexes have outperformed traditional indexes since their creation. So in other words, to be green has led to better performance. In conclusion, the world has changed over the past 5 years. In Paris, 195 countries agreed to address climate change. Renewable energy is becoming competitive compared to coal. Populations and asset owners are getting mobilized. On their own, none of these forces will be enough to catalyze change. But when they all change at the same time and get aligned, then you have a tipping point. And that's exactly the moment we are living. So, Chairman and members of the committee, you have an incredible window of opportunity to regulate polluting companies to ensure the stability of our financial systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final witness has practical experience predicting bubbles successfully, and indeed founded a company precisely to validate his predictions of the mortgage credit bubble that led to the 2008 financial crisis. That gives him quite a track record when he comes in to give warnings of further financial perils. And Mr. Burt, we welcome you.
Well, thank you, Senator Whitehouse, Chairman Schatz, and members of the committee, both for the opportunity to be here and also just for your ongoing work on this very important topic. My name is Dave Burt. I'm the founder and CEO of a new investment research company called Delta Terra Capital. I've been analyzing real estate and real estate derivatives markets for 20 years as an institutional investor. I'm currently focused on what I believe to be a large risk mispricing issue in real estate markets related to climate risk. As physical risks increase, so should insurance costs and taxes, putting pressure on home values as these homes become less affordable. However, costs have been artificially constrained for a few very important reasons. Private insurance rates have stayed artificially low because of state regulations and backwards-looking catastrophe models. Flood risk is underappreciated and oversubsidized through the FEMA and FIP processes. And most of all, 30-year mortgages are qualified based on an assumption that insurance costs will never increase. Ultimately, this assumption is no more ludicrous than the idea in 2006 and 2007 that somehow subprime borrowers would have massive pay raises when their adjustable rate mortgages reset. Overvalued real estate presents its own risk to the economy, but this particular bubble is also leading to complacency in the general population and therefore inaction on the part of policymakers around climate. As long as people can still get cheap insurance and cheap financing and their home values keep going up despite the increasing risk, they will continue to buy into the denial narrative. If you all take nothing else away from my testimony today, I want you to think long and hard about the implications of government's artificial, if well-intended, support for home values in risky areas. The first chart on my page here illustrates the current disconnect between insurance premiums in the green bars, and I think each of you should have a copy of this in your folder as well, and an estimate of the actual risks of loss from flooding, wind, and wildfire. That's the orange bars. Okay. The next chart compares my forecast for 5-year home price appreciation for the best and worst performing regions by quintile after considering financial impacts from rising insurance premiums. So those are the light blue bars on the second chart. This suggests that 20% of the country that is most vulnerable is overvalued by 44%, which is greater than the decline we saw for the worst quintile performers over the 2007 to 2012 period. Those are the dark blue bars. While these forecasts include many assumptions and some of the statistical modeling is complex, the underlying dynamics are very intuitive. Higher levels of greenhouse gases lead to increasing temperatures. Higher temperatures lead to increasing risks of damage from severe weather. Higher risks lead to increasing costs, and higher costs lead to lower home values. Default rates have always spiked in risky areas following catastrophes, but now we are starting to see elevated default rates in risky areas during stable climate periods as well. You can see this dynamic playing out on the third chart, which shows default rates in the riskiest geographies relative to the safest ones for Freddie Mac loans that are part of the credit risk transfer program that they started in 2013. This brings us to a really important point on the current market structure. So while aggregate mortgage credit risk is much smaller than it was prior to the global financial crisis, the risk of loss that is out there is being concentrated in a very similar subordinated bond market called CRT, or credit risk transfer. In 2012, when the FHFA realized how difficult it was going to be to take Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae out of conservatorship, they mandated that the agencies transfer some of their credit risks to the private markets to reduce taxpayer exposure. Now there are $55 billion in CRT bonds outstanding, supporting $1.8 trillion in Fannie and Freddie loans, as pictured in the last chart. My model suggests that losses in a rationalization scenario would be enough to wipe out most of the outstanding CRT market, and that's that last orange bar. And yet, money managers are buying these bonds at sub 4% yields. I personally feel that this aggressive pricing has more to do with the fact that these are the only bonds out there now that can make high-fee securitized mandates work. So banks are pushing mortgage credit to the agencies are pushing the risk to private institutional investors, and institutional investors have a large personal incentive to keep buying bonds while ignoring climate risk. The complacency continues as we march towards a horrible climate outcome for future generations. Here are 3 ideas that this committee might help pursue to break this horrible cycle. Remove subsidies from the NFIP program, and don't let risk rating 2.0 get watered down by politics. Encourage state regulators to let insurance companies raise rates rather than relying on reinsurance markets to protect their solvency. And add a consideration for increasing insurance costs in the qualification process performed by Freddie and Fannie, and expand and enforce insurance requirements for agency loans. Thank you again for your time and consideration.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be here through the entire hearing, so I'm not going to ask most of my questions at the beginning. The order will be Senator Schatz, Senator Bennett, and Senator Stabenow, but I do want to ask you one question each. Mr. Litterman said, I'm quoting him here from his remarks, voluntary actions are not enough, that it is actually going to take government action to change the deformation of the marketplace enough to avoid the looming calamity. I just want to get each of yours opinion on that point. Can we count on voluntary action, or as members of Congress, do we need to tell our colleagues that we need to act?
Very briefly, yes. Voluntary actions are not enough. There must be action taken. I think that U.S. economic policymakers, including the Fed and the Treasury, really need to be doing more.
And with Congress?
And Congress as well can help guide that, can help in your oversight capacity make sure that they are, in essence, taking financial stability into account, which is part of the mandates you gave them.
Mr. Litterman, I used your words. Do I have you right?
You have me right, Senator. Incentives are incredibly fundamental. I like the word incentives. You know what incentives are? Anything that changes behavior is an incentive. In a market economy, incentives are wages and prices. And right now, we are not pricing climate risk. We're not pricing the externality of emissions. And in fact, there are subsidies in the U.S. and globally toward both the production and consumption of fossil fuels. As long as those incentives go in the direction that they do, behavior will follow. Incentives are to human behavior like forces are to, inanimate objects. We have to change the incentive system. It's a bug in the tax code.
Mr. Samama?
3 things. In order to mobilize capital markets, we need more disclosure on the risks coming from corporates. We need the carbon footprints and so on in order for us to assess properly the risks. Second, governments should invest more into R&D. There's a report from Nick Stern on that, saying that in the OECD, roughly we invest $6 billion into R&D for renewable energy versus $550 billion into subsidies for fossil fuel energy. It should be fixed.
Without going to the whole list, the short point, Congress should act and not just be a bystander. Would that be your recommendation?
Well, I'm French, so I cannot make a recommendation for the.
Fair enough, Mr. Burt.
Yes, Congress should act. Ultimately, climate should be thought of as a social good. So, individualized efforts really only work if, everybody trying to increase their size of the pie actually results in the biggest increase to the overall pie that you can imagine. That's what happens with widgets and things. You wouldn't try and solve healthcare or education without government. I think that's probably the best parallel.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you to all of the testifiers. I actually just have one question. As we imagine in our mind's eye a correction in markets due to the sort of realization of the physical risks and the transition risks related to climate change and our inaction. I guess what I'm trying to puzzle through is that in other downturns, there were structural problems, there were interventions, there were reforms. But to the extent that these are physical risks that are, even after the correction, ongoing, does that change the way we look at this in terms of an economic cycle? In other words, it's not like we just take a hit and then you, as is now a famous phrase, buy the dip and everything recovers. I'm trying to figure out how we recover and how the global economy recovers when the physical risks remain. Is the idea that at some point it's priced properly? But I'll start with Ms. Raskin.
Yeah, it's a really important observation, because essentially what we want to see happen is some form of movement towards a path that is actually going to be a path that is one that permits us all to habitate and exist in a significantly warmer climate. The costs associated with this transition are significant, as you've recognized, and we need some guidance around the way markets are going to perform, so that the kind of dramatic jolt that could otherwise happen and wipe out and be systemic in the entire economy is avoided. So
it seems to me this is the kind of risk that's obviously there are not that many similarities, but in terms of the current market and its response to coronavirus, the idea that you can intervene with stimulus or with sort of old-fashioned, the cycle's going down, and now we're going to do our Keynesian thing, or we're going to do some regulatory reforms. Those are not the tools that will work this time. I'm going to move on. Not that I couldn't spend 20 minutes with you, but I only have 2.5 more. Mr. Litterman?
Yeah, no, I think, Senator, your intuition is right on target. I think that the physical risks are going to impact growth over a long term. There's no reason to think it's going to be a cyclical impact on the economy. The transition risks, I think, are real, and they should be a concern of government, but I think they can be addressed by fiscal and monetary policy. Now, there's going to be the main impact of the transition, and it's going to be a rapid transition. When you all finally get your act together and price emissions, that's going to be a dramatic change in the economy, and it's going to change the valuation of many securities. I think the market is already anticipating that, and you can see it in the decline in the valuations of many of the fossil fuels. The coal industry has collapsed already once, and it's in the process of collapsing again. Oil companies' valuations have declined dramatically over the last few years relative to the market. I don't think that it's likely, but it is certainly a potential risk, and I think that Congress needs to address those regions and industries that will be impacted. So yeah, it's a concern.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. I'm very grateful that you're here. Donald Trump, I'm not asking for a political answer here, I'm asking for an economic answer. Donald Trump ran for office as a climate denier, and he wasn't shy about it. And the fundamental argument that he put forward to the American people, which were accepted by a lot of people, was that if we deal with climate change, we will destroy the American economy. If we contend with climate change, we'll destroy the economy. If we ignore climate change, the economy is going to be just fine. I have reasons of my own that why I think he won that political argument, and I think it's tragic that he did, but he did. How would you answer that economic argument if you were standing on a debate stage with Donald Trump and he were saying, if we deal with climate change, we'll destroy the American economy. If we ignore it, it will be fine. Anybody? Sarah, you?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I would say if we ignore climate change, we, in essence, destroy the economy. We are seeing, incidentally, as we deal right now with the significant market volatility that has not priced in the risk appropriately of our country's ability to deal with the health of its people, right? And inability to actually have smooth transitions around what should be the kind of shocks that the economy gets periodically. And the fact that you see in this extreme market volatility a dramatic lurches, I think, indicate certainly one subset of economic harms. Now, we also know that what the market does is not, in essence, what the economy is doing, right? And one thing that I think he needs sort of a correction on is this idea that economic well-being is measured completely by what is happening in markets. And of course, we know that that is not the case. And so we look to the underlying harms to the economy that are certainly occurring now with the coronavirus, but also on an ongoing basis and continuous basis regarding climate.
Yeah, I would add to that the risk framing is really important here. We don't know what's going to happen. We're doing an experiment on a very complex planet that's got 7 billion humans on it, and we've never done this experiment before. We know there are externalities associated with greenhouse gases. We know that it's increasing the temperature and having other dramatic impacts. Where we are today is at 1 degree C of increase in temperature relative to the historical level, and where we're already baked in is something like 1.5 to 2 degrees C. What most people don't realize is how alarmingly fast the risk is increasing. Basically, for every 3 years of delay in pricing emissions, that maximum temperature goes up by 1/10 of a degree C. If we're at 1.8 degrees today, in 6 years, we'll be at 2 degrees, inevitably, because it's going to take that long to reduce emissions and then get to net zero and then pull them out of the atmosphere. One way to think about this from an economic perspective, one simple way, is that it's very likely that every ton of carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere today will have to be pulled out at some point in the future. It's much more expensive to pull it out than it is not to put it in. That's a liability that we're leaving to our children and our grandchildren. And you know, the IPCC has written very persuasively about the risks and the difference between a 1.5 degree increase, which is already horrible, and a 2 degree, which is catastrophic. So, you know, it's a trade-off between cost today and risk tomorrow. And we have to make that balance. We're not making that balance.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. It's really a question of timing. It's this trade-off. So, you know, like many anti-regulatory policies, you're pulling forward economic growth from the future. But I think that the most important point is it's not a one-for-one trade-off. So, you know, we're taking a little bit of extra growth now, potentially at the risk of massive negative growth impacts in the future.
Very quickly, 3 points. The first one is that the fact that 59 central banks have put climate change on their agenda send a signal. The Bundesbank, the Bank of England, Banque de France, in Singapore, in China, and so on, they all say, we don't change our mandates. We just understand that now climate change is threatening the financial stability. The second point is that all the risks we talked about, the physical risks, the transitory risks, and the societal risks are interacting with each other, and they have a lot of non-linearities. It means that they can accelerate the other one. And then when it starts, it's very complicated to know how it will end. That's why we have a lot of uncertainties related to climate change. And the third one, to echo what Bob said, is that if we do nothing, in the worst-case scenario by IPCC, half of the planet will be unlivable by the end of the century. It will not be possible to live in South America, Central America, part of the US, Africa, India, and so on and so on. So the risk is there. We are putting humanity at risk. We want it or we don't want it. And the good news is that the rest of the world is moving pretty fast. We are taking, many regulations are taking place around the planet. Investors are getting mobilized, and so on and so on. So the world sends a signal that they are taking this problem very seriously.
Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you very much.
Senator Van Hollen, too.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse, Senator Schatz, for your incredible leadership, and to all colleagues. And thank you all for being here. There's so many things that we need to be talking about and sending the alarm out, and thank you for doing that. I just came from a Senate Agriculture Committee hearing and spoke also to the Michigan Farm Bureau this morning, and our farmers in our country are asking real questions about how they can be part of the solution in terms of carbon sequestration and being able to more aggressively do things that they are doing to keep carbon in the ground, and to be able to also have a carbon marketplace which goes to the price of carbon, pricing carbon, so they can be part of this solution and create a carbon trading system as a part of it. So I'm working very aggressively at trying to help them get there. But with my hat on, with the Committee on Agriculture, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission is under our committee, and the regulation of that. And I'm so pleased that our Commissioner, Russ Benham, has put together a subcommittee that Mr. Litterman, I'm so pleased that you are heading this. And I wondered, this is important, that we have a climate-related market risk subcommittee at the CFTC. So I wonder if you might just take a moment to talk about the work so far, what your next steps are at this point. We know you have a final report, I think, later this year. It's going to be very important. We will be watching it closely, lifting it up closely, along with all the other work that's being done. But this is a very important piece of the puzzle right now.
Thank you very much, Senator. Yes, I'm very pleased to be chairing that committee, and Commissioner Benham has done a wonderful job in setting it up and recruiting terrific members of the committee. We have representation from the largest banks, the insurance companies, from corporates, including oil companies and ag companies, as well as academics, the NGO community, and so on. The committee has met a number of times, has created work streams, and is now drafting its chapters. We're scheduled to present the report to the CFTC Market Risk Advisory Committee on June 24th. And we will touch on a number of topics. Just briefly, we'll review both the physical and transition risks. We'll be looking at the impacts on financial markets, as well as potential impacts in terms of systemic impacts. We'll be talking about the risk analysis that must be done by both investors, asset owners, and corporates. We'll have a work stream on scenario analysis and looking especially at the international coordination. It's very important that we have common approaches around the world. And so the work that the BIS has done, the NGFS, the TCFD, the Bank of England, and so on is very much taken into account. We'll have a section on disclosure, and we'll be talking about things that the financial markets can do to both help to hedge climate risk, as well as remove the impediments to the capital that needs to flow into the creation of a low carbon economy. Having said all that, the capital markets are very efficient, but we need the right incentives. The bottom line, and we'll say this in the report as well, is you have to have appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. And until we do that, we're moving in the wrong direction.
Thank you very much. And just to underscore that, I mean, bottom line is we need to price carbon into the economy, right? So
right.
That we need to be doing that. And Mr. Samawa, I just want to emphasize that this group understands that the incentives are in the wrong place. Even in the tax bill that just passed last year, as a member of the Senate Finance Committee, I can tell you there was a new $4 billion incentive given to oil internationally, which I tried to get eliminated. We're not successful in doing that. But we're looking at tens of billions of dollars in oil incentives, fossil fuel incentives, and I'm always struck when colleagues on the other side of the aisle, or when the White House says we shouldn't be picking winners and losers. Actually, 100 years ago in the tax code, we picked a winner, and they're still winning. And so what we're trying to do is level the playing field here, and in from the context of climate change, obviously get rid of that incentive, but even just leveling the playing field for wind and solar and other clean energies has been impossible. So we've had 100 years of policy, tax policy. It's not been phased out. We've not had to renew it every 5 years or every 2 years. It's been embedded in the tax code, and that needs to change. And we're going to continue to very much focus on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stabenow. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all your work in this area, and thank all of you for being here. Professor Bloom-Raskin, it's great to see you. Governor Bloom-Raskin, and I don't know if we have any other Marylanders on the panel, but we're glad to have you. Let me just say a couple things, and I've got a question. Number one, there's no doubt we have to price carbon into the economy, right? Some of us have been pushing this for decades. Whether we have a tax or a cap, whatever it is, we need to factor that in. But given the fact that we're not there yet, despite efforts that are being taken, the question is, the testimony has been clear that there are substantial risks to the economy. But my question is twofold. One is, to what extent do you see banks, companies factoring in that risk? For example, I haven't seen anybody writing down the value of their assets. To what extent is the market currently factoring in the risk right now? In other words, through where they're making the investments, interest rates charged for corporate debt, that kind of thing. Sarah, you mentioned in your statement the fact that you could have a very, rapid course correction, right? You talk about the 2008 meltdown we're experiencing right now, the impact of the coronavirus on the economy. You say the point is that a dramatic, sudden, and lagged reassessment of financial efforts could provide a big shock to the economy. So if we stay on our current course, which is not adequately preparing, what kind of events do you see triggering that kind of sudden shock in the economy? Right now, it's a coronavirus. Is there any kind of shock that you could see leading to a dramatic sort of, oh my God, we sort of missed the runway here moment?
So first of all, thank you for your significant work in this area. Your leadership is really appreciated, and I think you understand these issues both instinctively but very analytically. A couple of things. I think that markets are not completely pricing in the risks that we've been discussing at length. If we continue on the current course, if markets continue on the current course, they will probably continue to misprice these carbon assets. This mispricing, which we are seeing now in the context of the coronavirus, this mispricing can have dramatic effects. And what exactly it would take if in fact it's going to be a declaration of a pandemic, which is going to cause the turbulence, or whether in essence it's going to be something of a number of fatalities, we just we don't know. In a way, it doesn't really matter, okay? Because what really we want to be doing from a financial stability perspective is avoiding this kind of turbulence because of its systemic implications, its ability to drag down the entire economy and to keep the economy from being resilient, from being able to bounce back. So from that perspective, the work of providing markets with a framework with which they can begin to do this pricing accurately is the role of policymakers right now. What does such a framework look like? That kind of framework has disclosure, for example, systematic, uniform, common language disclosure regarding how these risks are going to get communicated. When that begins to happen, we should be able to begin to give markets the ability to do a more accurate pricing. In addition, there is a role for risk management. By this, I mean there is a supervisory function that the Federal Reserve, for example, holds. And that supervisory function needs to be exercised in a way that requires firms that it regulates to start taking into account these risks. These are real risks to financial stability. It is in the Fed's mandate to be concerned with financial stability. So their supervisory role really needs to be moving ahead. Now, I do want to say that that our European counterparts and other countries' central banks are really much ahead of us. They know exactly, they're a couple steps ahead. So we're not making this up. We are seeing the analysis that has been done, the recommendations that are being made, and there are firms that are starting to disclose. But if they just disclose using their language and there's another kind of disclosure that another set of firms use, it's really, you don't have the ability, investors don't have the ability to compare apples to apples. It's going to look different. And, from my perspective, it will not provide the kind of adjustment that we need in markets so that we avoid this systemic risk.
Don't worry about going on. It's just us now, and let's let everybody answer.
Sure.
I think that what has changed dramatically is the fact that the public opinion is ready. 5 years ago, climate change was only for a few economists, researchers, and so on. Now you can't open a newspaper around the planet or watch TV without having something on climate change. And it changes really everything, because then whatever happens on the physical side or the transitioning side can trigger a decision from the policy makers to change the games. And then it can have an impact on many corporates. Concrete example, we had a will to regulate the auto car maker industry for many years, and nothing was happening. And then there was this scandal with Volkswagen when they developed the software and so on. And it did not only impact Volkswagen, but it triggered a new regulation in Europe or by the mayors of major cities. For example, the mayor of Paris decided that by 2025, there will be no diesel car in Paris, while it represents 60% of the market. And then suddenly, Peugeot and Renault, the two main auto car makers in France, had to switch, I would say almost overnight, the way they are producing their cars. And it's not only in France. Now, through the European regulation, the entire sector has to adapt, and in a very abrupt way, without having a demand from clients, without having the technology, but due to the fact that the European Commission has decided that we had to change the criteria to have cars on the road. So here again, my point is to say that when the public opinion is ready, whatever happens can trigger a reaction from the policymakers that can have major impacts on entire industries. And we have a concrete example here in Europe. And one of the reasons why Fiat had to merge is the fact that they didn't have the technology, so they were caught by surprise. And they had to find a partner that had the engineers, the technology, in order to survive.
Thank you.
I would add that, one of the things that the way investors think about this transition is that they expect that at some point policy is going to change, that there will be incentives created. They just don't know when. And so they see this uncertainty about policy. And I would say most investors do not expect it to happen soon. I actually am much more optimistic because I think, like Fred, that we are close to a tipping point. But because there is that uncertainty, that policy uncertainty, investors and asset owners are very uncertain about where to put their capital. Do you put it into another, fossil fuel power plant? Do we put it into a sustainable energy source, and so on? And I think that when that policy changes, I think that will actually create a boom in investment as that uncertainty is reduced. So I would not be as concerned about the effect of a dramatic change in policy. In fact, I think that will unleash capital to move into the investments that are required for the low carbon economy.
So I agree with that. We'd like to move as rapidly as possible toward the policy change. Obviously, at least in this country, politics and elections will determine whether or not that happens. We've had insurance company executives before this panel. They obviously have to price in this risk, because if they don't, they could go out of business if they don't take that into account. But for example, as you say, other investors in the economy investing in fossil fuels, there are two risks. One is they have to prepare for a policy change. The other is, if we don't wake up in time politically here, what kind of actual external shock to the system happens, right, as a result of a continuing, climate change. And I don't know. I hope that we don't reach that point where you have to have the equivalent of a pandemic in climate terms in order to trigger that kind of policy change. And we're all hoping that we're able to make those policy changes sooner rather than later. But right now, it seems to me that other than companies whose dollars and bottom line is absolutely determined by getting it kind of right, like insurance companies having to insure forest fires in California, it does not seem to me right now that the market there's so much uncertainty. It's just hard to figure out where to price either the risk of a policy change or the risk of some external climate change related event happening that shakes the market so much that people decide to divest of their fossil fuel stocks.
So, obviously $1 trillion storm would do it, right? That's like the pandemic equivalent. But you might get that next year. You might not get that for 10 years. And then you're well beyond the 2-degree threshold that we're worried about. The incentives issue is the big one. And we're all talking about this. We're all on the same page. This needs to happen. But for some reason, policy isn't fully behind it. And I spoke to this in my testimony, but ultimately, the general population has to be voting on this, and the general population isn't going to necessarily vote on this unless they see their current financial position at risk. And unfortunately, as a government, we're doing a lot of things to actually protect in the most well-meaning way, to protect their current financial position, when in fact there's this big mismatch between the true value of their biggest asset, their home, and where it's currently valued based on the support from government. And really this comes down, you talked about insurance. Insurance policies are 1 year, 3 years. The big mispricing is a mortgage is 30 years. An investment in a home is supposed to be forever. Mm-hmm. So that's the big disconnect. It's not the insurers. It's the mindset of investors as to if and when they're actually going to have to absorb these costs.
Right. I agree. Thank you. Thank you all.
Let me wrap up by asking you all the same question. You are all extremely bright people. You are all extremely knowledgeable in financial markets and in economics, but I'm going to ask you to step out of the jargon of your expertise and look at the area that I think Bob described of extreme but plausible events. things that it is responsible and prudent to plan for, even though they may be very high-impact outcomes. In that arena of extreme but plausible, answer me two simple questions on climate. How bad and how soon? Trying to be as free of jargon as you can because we're trying to reach a broader audience than just experts.
All right. So how bad? Extremely bad. Bad right now, even though we have not had the effect, we have not seen the effects of a single event bring the economy down. The cumulative effect is quite astounding. How soon? It is happening right now. We are in the midst of the extraordinary destruction and deterioration of our economy now. So this is with us at this moment. There is nothing to be waiting for.
Mr. Letterman?
Yeah, you know, there's so many dimensions to this problem. It would take probably hours, and you really need climate scientists to talk about all the different dimensions to it. But I would say, look, the impacts on human health of climate change could be very dramatic. The melting of the tundra could release, you know, viruses that haven't been seen for tens of thousands of years that we have no protection for. So you could imagine pandemics, not to mention, you know, the mosquitoes and so on that will be coming. And there's the national security issues. And then just in terms of the science, there's tipping points that, you know, scientists have talked about along many, many dimensions. So I think the risk is best captured by thinking about the maximum temperature that we're building in that we can't get around. And, you know, we're now somewhere between 1.5 and 2. The IPCC says we'll lose 70 to 90% of coral reefs at 1.5, and we've blown through that. So that's in the cards. We've already done that. At 2 degrees, which we're a few years away from, probably, we're going to lose more than 99% of coral reefs. I can't imagine how we can leave that to our grandchildren. A planet destroyed like that is just unconscionable.
How bad, how soon?
On the two aspects, very bad and very soon, we can see that on our day-to-day lives with fires in California, Australia, and so on. So the physical events are booming everywhere around the planet and putting lives of people at risk. And on the societal risks, sometimes we forgot to mention, I briefly say that 143 million people in South America, Africa, and India will have certainly to migrate by 2050. 86 million in Africa only. Let's imagine that 10% of them are shifting to the north. It means that 8.6 million people will arrive in Europe by 2050. What I'm trying to say here is that we have moves of people that could destabilize entire countries or regions. We can think about Syria. It started with a drought. People in the countryside could not get access to some food. They went to the cities, and then we had a war, and then we had hundreds of people on the road without mentioning the dead people. So what I'm trying to say here is that this problem really has many dimensions, and they all react to each other, and it's happening here and now, and the consequences are very hard to assess. The only thing we can say is that it's a very hard situation.
Mr. Burt, finally, and then we'll turn to Senator Merkley, who has joined us.
So everyone covered a lot of the real nasty consequences. I'm just going to bring it back to numbers and the economy, and you know how bad in the U.S. maybe we withstood $75 billion a year in losses due to severe weather events in the prior decade. I think we should probably expect 100 to 125 billion a year in the next decade. If we don't rein in the problem so that those costs continue to increase at 50 to 75% a decade, and you include risk premiums to take into account the fact that this is going to keep getting worse, that can easily turn that 125 billion a year and sort of economic damages into 300 billion a year economic damages. And I think that's, it's around the corner. So how soon the mispricing is there, it just has to correct.
Senator Merkley.
Thank you all very much. Every conversation I've had in the last couple of weeks has involved in some fashion or another risk assessment, but risk around the coronavirus. And it makes it clear how uncertain things can be. I don't know if we were having the conversation in a hearing a year ago, if we had a version of the cold that had higher lethality, what could it do to America? I'm not sure we'd be able to have captured all the ways it could reverberate in the ways we're seeing right now. And so as we think about how climate change can reverberate, I'm sure there's going to be many unexpected pathways and challenges, things that are identifiable now. And as you mentioned, the coral reefs. Well, off the coast of Oregon, the kelp beds are disappearing. What's the impact going to be on our shrimp, on our crabs, on our groundfish, on our salmon? We don't really know. And is it a climate related? Well, yes, because warmer, more acidic water has unleashed a virus among the sea stars. The sea stars have died. They've disappeared. The blue sea urchins are wiping out the kelp. The kelp are habitat for whole hundreds of different sea life ecological influences. As we talk about this issue, I'd like you all to give us some perspective on how this conversation is unfolding in other places. We have Australia with massive fires and dying coral reefs, and yet doubling down on coal. Are they having a conversation about this type of financial risk? What about Germany? Are there some places we can look to where this conversation is proceeding that might give us some insights and thoughts?
I will start, Senator Merkley, and thank you for your observations and your work in this area. This conversation is completely happening outside the United States. In fact, the U.S. is so behind in dealing with these issues that it is almost embarrassing. Okay, how it is the fact that we can have a country that is somehow seemingly isolated from the debates regarding how we are supposed to be moving forward through these climate risks is pretty extraordinary and shocking. From the work that I deal with, so I'm going to look just from the perspective of climate risks being recognized as financial risks, just looking at it from that frame. Everything that we have learned in this area has come from another country's central bank, another country's set of economic policy makers. You have, in essence, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank. They have now talked about climate stress tests. They've talked about building into their actual missions of conducting monetary policy, a way in which to think about climate-related risks. You have task forces on disclosure. You have carbon pricing projects. All of these efforts by economic policymakers are being engaged in without the help or assistance or participation by U.S. economic policymakers. So the debates are out there, the analysis is out there, in fact, the actions are out there. They are happening outside the United States.
Anybody else like to weigh in on that?
Well, I would like to speak about my old country, France. We are an example of mobilization at all possible levels. First, President Macron has organized the One Planet Summit after the Paris Agreement held at the COP21. Second, we have the Secretariat of the NGFS that gathers now 59 central banks around the planet having put climate change on the agenda. And interestingly as well, the asset owners like FRR that is equivalent to CalPERS or CalSTRS, a public pension fund, has been very innovative and has decided to use its resources to reduce climate change-related risks by developing some financial tools, the low carbon indexes I described in my testimony, and it's now a 50 billion market. And they have outperformed with this product. So here you have a case study of a public pension fund leading the world. And something I would like to mention as well, the regulatory environment. In 2015, France passed a law, the Article 173 of the law on the energy transition, that say that all asset owners must assess and disclose their climate change-related risks. It means that all pension funds, all insurance companies in France must do their homework regarding climate change. It means that we have obtained that not only the leaders are taking action, but the entire market. And when it happens, it spreads the pressure towards the entire system, the asset managers in France and around the planet. So here you have a country that really activate all possible means, the political power, the regulation, and the asset owners or the asset managers to accelerate the transition.
I want to go back to part of your point in regard to, you mentioned the idea of stress tests, Ms. Raskin, and I don't know if Brian's going to be able to join us at this gathering.
He was.
Oh, did he already ask about this, about his bill regarding establishing legislation for stress tests here in the United States? Have you all had a chance to look at his proposal, which I certainly found very interesting, to establish climate stress tests as part of our routine financial, I guess, risk calculation strategy?
Yeah, let me respond to that. The CFTC Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee is definitely looking into stress testing, and stress testing is clearly a very important component of climate risk management. The issue for the financial community really is, can we get meaningful disclosure from different industries that reflect different exposures? So the exposures that a bank might have to the credit portfolio that it owns might be very different than the issues that an insurance company faces or that an oil company faces, and so on. So what we're trying to do, and we're trying to work with investors and asset owners around the world, is to create meaningful disclosure, and stress testing is certainly an important part of that. And if you're referring to the systemic risk and central banks that are looking at stress testing, yes, absolutely, climate-related stress tests should be part of that.
Thank you.
I'll just make one comment on that is, most of the work I've seen on stress testing considers physical risks and transition risks. Physical risks usually focus on things like supply chain impact on companies or real estate exposure. And just one of the things that I want to highlight is I think most of these scenario techniques actually understate the impact of physical risk on valuations and risks, because there's a big body of work out there being done now to measure, the probability that a storm hits a particular piece of real estate and what the damages might look like. There's almost none being done to say what are the consequences of those long-term results on the markets, the financial ecosystems that support those markets today. And I think it's really underappreciated.
And again, I think this is an extremely important topic. The idea really of doing a climate-related stress test, even if it's not perfect at the outset, we've seen through the other stress tests that the Fed conducts from a supervisory perspective, the stress tests that they do every year for the largest financial institutions. We've learned that discipline, just the fact that they are doing these stress tests, has created a risk management culture within particular regulated firms that has actually enhanced safety and soundness, has helped minimize the chances of financial instability. So even just the notion of creating a discourse around the idea of having a mandatory climate-related stress test and why that stress test is different from the current ones being conducted, I think is an important step.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
We're going to wrap up. I'd just like to close with a signal to the world from inside the Congress about the environment that we are in politically and how that bears on our prospects for taking the steps that you've all indicated are necessary for a survivable solution to all of this. Congress, I think, really has to act. And whether it's improving stress tests or putting, my favorite, a price on carbon, which I know Mr. Litterman is a great advocate for, offsetting the $650 billion subsidy that fossil fuel enjoys every year in the United States, according to the International Monetary Fund, not the greenest organization on the planet. It's incumbent on Congress to act. But Congress acts in a hydraulic political environment of force and counterforce from powerful interests. And at the moment, what I want to share with the panel and the world is that while some of the worst behavior of the fossil fuel industry has been moderated or obscured through deniable intermediaries, and while, in my opinion, evil organizations like the Heartland Institute appear to be suffering a collapse, which could not be more helpful. Nevertheless, the prevailing weight, political weight of the fossil fuel industry on this body, both directly and through its vast array of intermediary front groups, remains completely opposed to any serious climate legislation. The CEOs may say they support a carbon price, but down on the gun decks of the industry, that message has either not been sent or has been accompanied by a quiet counter message saying, that's for public relations purposes. Keep doing what you're doing. So you have one of the most powerful political forces in America still highly dedicated to stopping any action. So that's point one, was we need to act. Point two is the fossil fuel industry is a persistent, determined, and remorseless obstructor of action today. And the third is that the cavalry from the rest of America has not yet arrived. People may talk a good game at the climate CLC group. People may have really cool carbon policies in their corporation, and they may actually even have good sustainability policies that they push out their supply chains. But when they show up in Congress and when their lobbyists show up in Congress, nothing is the net contribution of all of the good guys. My favorite example is Coke and Pepsi, because they have forward-leaning policies in their companies. They have forward-leaning positions in their supply chains. They don't lobby on this when they come in. And their trade association, the American Beverage Association, has told us to our face that they are not lobbying on climate stuff because they have not been told to by the entities. And Coke and Pepsi run money both to the American Beverage Association and to the United States Chamber of Commerce, and through the American Beverage Association to the United States Chamber of Commerce. And as Influence Map has just reported, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, although it's improving on the margins, has been and continues to be one of the two worst climate obstructors in America. So, you know, it's like you've come across a boat, it's turtled, You need to find out what's going on inside. You knock on the sunken hull. Are there signs of life in there? I'm knocking from the inside saying, yes, there are signs of life. But in my world, the hydraulic pressure of the rest of corporate America to push back on the fossil fuel industry has not arrived. We see the cavalry massing on the hills. We're reassured that there's some activity, but it has not yet come to the battlefield. So it's expecting a lot of Congress to do something big on climate, while all of these groups that are so vociferously publicly concerned about climate are not showing up on game day, are not showing up on the field, don't even have their jerseys and helmets on. And through all of its multiple, long-developed, secretive minions, the fossil fuel industry is still fully at its business. I offer that not just as a condemnation of the fossil fuel industry's continued malevolent behavior, secretive and malevolent behavior, not just as a reproach to the rest of corporate America for being absent without leave in this forum, but also as a signal of hope and optimism, because we're just as far away from getting this done as they are from showing up. They could show up tomorrow and the politics would change. They could show up next week and the politics could change. So it's really a question of the agricultural industry, the financial industry, the consumer goods industry, coastal property-related industries, local banks and real stores and so forth, actually showing up. Shouldn't be too hard to ask important, powerful entities in the private sector to align their political behavior with their stated values. This is not a question of having to ask them to change their stated values. This is a question of align your political behavior with your stated values and show up. And if you do, this will change very, very rapidly. It is not a partisan problem. We are in touch with enough Republicans who want to solve this and have been through the lost decade of Citizens United and remember the pre-Citizens United world of 5 climate bills percolating in the Senate, all bipartisan, all significant, to know that this is not a partisanship issue. This is the oldest issue of legislators, self-dealing, the use of political power to preserve financial advantage. The fossil fuel industry has masked it a bit, and they focused on the Republican Party to create the illusion of partisanship. But if you can break the back of the fossil fuel industry's lying and denial apparatus by putting an opposing force up against it, and the financial community has easily the wherewithal and the political knowledge to be that opposing force, as does Big Ag, then we're in a whole new world in Congress. So with that thought, I'm incredibly grateful to all of you. You are extremely knowledgeable. This was powerful testimony. We're going to make full use of it in our arguments and persuasion on this issue as we go forward. And thanks, God bless you, and Godspeed in your work.
Good job, Bob. Nice to hear your work.
The White House is great.
Oh, he's always been great at this. What is the Heartland Institute? What is he?
Heartland is
Yeah,
one
who
of
is
these
that?
denier institutes.
Oh, really?
This has been funded. Yeah.
Wow.
It's going on.